He was ordered to punish them, but what he saw made him drop his rifle. Pacific Theater, August 1945. The war was ending, but Private James Takeshi stood at a crossroads that had nothing to do with victory or defeat. In his hand, a rifle. In his pocket, an order written in deliberately vague language. Punish the prisoners who refuse to work. Make an example. James was a Nisei soldier, Japanese-American, born in California, raised speaking both English and Japanese at home, now wearing the uniform of the United States Army while his mother and two younger sisters lived behind barbed wire in Manzanar internment camp. Every mission he completed, every order he followed was a test, not of his courage, not of his skill, but of his loyalty to a country that had imprisoned his family for the crime of looking like the enemy. The 422nd Regimental Combat Team, the unit James had trained with before being transferred to the Pacific as a translator, became the most decorated unit in American military history. They fought in Europe while their families were locked up in desert camps in California, Arizona, Utah. They bled for a nation that questioned whether they were truly American, and they did it because they believed that service would prove what words could not, that they belonged. But James never made it to Europe. His language skills were too valuable. The Army needed translators in the Pacific, where Japanese prisoners were rare and Japanese-speaking Americans even rarer. So they sent him to the Philippines, to Leyte, where the final bloody chapters of the Pacific War were being written in mud and monsoon rain. By August 1945, everyone knew the war was ending. The atomic bombs had fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement was days away. But in the chaos of war's final weeks, the machinery of military discipline continued grinding forward, sometimes without direction, sometimes without sense. Orders were passed down through exhausted chains of command. Young officers, barely older than the men they commanded, made decisions they weren't trained to make. And in the gaps between official policy and battlefield reality, moral tests emerged that no training manual had prepared anyone for. Japanese prisoners of war were extraordinarily rare in the Pacific Theater. The cultural shame of surrender was so profound that most Japanese soldiers chose death over capture. Those who were captured were almost exclusively wounded, unconscious, or too sick to resist. And female prisoners were rarer still. Nurses, medical auxiliaries, civilian staff caught in the wrong place when American forces overran Japanese positions. The Geneva Conventions were clear about how prisoners of war should be treated, but the conventions were written for European warfare, for armies that shared certain assumptions about honor and surrender. In the Pacific, where the rules of engagement had been rewritten by years of brutal island fighting, the conventions often felt like suggestions rather than requirements. James had been at the Leyte facility for 3 weeks when he received the order. The facility wasn't really a prisoner of war camp. It was a converted supply warehouse, hastily repurposed when a group of 7 Japanese women, nurses and medical auxiliaries, were captured during the final push through the Philippines. The women had been caring for wounded Japanese soldiers in a field hospital when American forces overran their position. Most of the soldiers had fought to the death. The women had no weapons. They surrendered. Captain Morrison, the officer in charge of the facility, was a career soldier from Georgia, 42 years old, weathered by 2 wars. He had fought in North Africa, in Italy, and now in the Pacific. He had seen things that made him question everything he thought he knew about warfare and humanity. When he called James into his office that morning, his face was unreadable. The order was simple. A group of prisoners had refused to work. They needed to be disciplined, punished. James was to handle it. Morrison's exact words were, "Make them understand that defiance has consequences." Then he handed James his rifle and dismissed him. James walked across the muddy compound toward the detention building. It had rained for 3 days straight, one of those tropical storms that turned everything into a swamp. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of rot. His boots squelched in the mud. His mind raced. What did punish mean? Physical punishment, reduced rations, solitary confinement? The order was deliberately vague, and James understood why. Plausible deniability. If something went wrong, if someone asked questions later, Morrison could say he never specified what kind of punishment. And James, the Japanese-American translator, would be the one who had to explain his actions. He thought about his mother. About the day the soldiers came to their house in Sacramento and told them they had 48 hours to pack what they could carry. His mother had been born in America. His father had immigrated legally, worked as a farmer for 20 years, paid taxes, sent his son to American schools. None of it mattered. They were Japanese. That was enough. James remembered the look in his mother's eyes when he told her he was enlisting. Not pride, not anger. Something more complicated. A kind of sad understanding. She knew why he was doing it. To prove something, to protect them somehow by demonstrating that the Takeshi family were loyal Americans. She hugged him and said nothing. What was there to say? Now he was walking toward a building full of Japanese women with orders to punish them, and he didn't know what that meant, and he didn't know who he was supposed to be in this moment. The loyal American soldier following orders? The Japanese-American man who understood the weight of being seen as the enemy? The son who remembered his mother's face? 2 young guards stood outside the detention building. They were both privates, younger than James, farm boys from Iowa or Nebraska, the kind of kids who had never seen an ocean before they shipped out to the Pacific. When James approached, they straightened up, but their faces showed something that made him slow down. Not respect, not fear, something else. Discomfort, maybe shame. "They're inside," one of them said. He wouldn't meet James's eyes. "They're in bad shape, Private. Real bad." James felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What do you mean, bad shape?" The guard shifted his weight. You'll see, Captain's orders were to keep them in there until you arrived." James pushed open the door. The smell hit him first. Sickness, human waste, the sweet rot smell of infected wounds. The building was dim, lit only by a few small windows set high in the walls. It took his eyes a moment to adjust. When they did, he saw them. 7 women, ages ranging from what looked like 19 to maybe 35. They were sitting or lying on the concrete floor. No beds, no blankets. Their uniforms, once white, were now brown with mud and dark with moisture. Several of them were shivering despite the tropical heat. One woman was lying completely still, her face turned toward the wall. Another was hunched over, arms wrapped around her stomach. A third was staring at him with eyes that held no hope, no fear, nothing. Just emptiness. None of them were wearing shoes. Their feet were cut, swollen, covered in mud. One woman had a wound on her leg that was clearly infected, red and weeping. Another was so thin that her collarbone stood out like knife edges. James stood in the doorway, rifle in his hands, and felt the world tilt. This wasn't defiance. This wasn't resistance. This was survival, or the end of it. He moved closer. The woman lying against the wall wasn't moving. He knelt down, reached out, touched her shoulder. She was burning with fever. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. Malaria, probably, or dengue, or any of a dozen tropical diseases that killed soldiers and prisoners alike in the Pacific. "What happened?" he asked in Japanese. His voice came out rougher than he intended. One of the women, the one who had been staring at him with empty eyes, spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper. "We were ordered to dig drainage ditches. During the storm, we tried, but we couldn't stand. They said we were refusing. They said we were defiant." James looked at her, really looked at her. She was maybe 25. She had probably been beautiful once. Now her face was gaunt, her lips cracked, her eyes sunken. She looked like she weighed 90 pounds. "When did you last eat?" he asked. "Yesterday, rice, a little. Water. This morning." James stood up. His hands were shaking. The rifle felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He looked at the 7 women, these enemy prisoners, these Japanese nurses who had been captured while caring for wounded soldiers, and he saw his mother. He saw his sisters. He saw human beings who were dying, slowly, in an American detention facility. and he had been sent here to punish them. The rifle slipped from his hands. It clattered on the concrete floor. The sound echoed in the small space. He turned and walked out of the building. The two guards looked at him, startled. "I need a medic," James said. His voice was steady now, clear. "Right now." But the captain said, "I don't care what the captain said. These are prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. They're sick. They're dying. Get the medic. Now." One of the guards ran. The other stayed, looking uncertain. James went back inside. He took off his field jacket, the one with his name stenciled on it, Takeshi, and he walked over to the woman with the fever. Gently, carefully, he lifted her head and slid the jacket under it as a pillow. Then he covered her with it. It wasn't much, but it was something. The woman who had spoken to him was watching. "Why?" she asked in Japanese. "Why are you helping us?" James looked at her. "Because you're human beings," he said, "and because this is wrong." The medic arrived 10 minutes later. His name was Corporal Davies, a kid from Philadelphia who had wanted to be a doctor before the war. He took one look at the women, and his face went white. "Jesus Christ," he said. "How long have they been like this?" "I don't know," James said, "but we need to get them help now." Davies started examining them one by one. Malaria, dysentery, infected wounds, severe dehydration, malnutrition. One of them had pneumonia. The woman with the fever was the worst. Her temperature was over 104 degrees. Davies looked at James. "She needs a hospital. They all do. But she needs one now, or she's going to die." James nodded. "I'll talk to the captain." He found Morrison in his office, sitting at his desk, staring at a map of the Philippines. When James entered, Morrison looked up. His face was still unreadable. "I couldn't do it, sir," James said. "I couldn't punish them." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Tell me what you saw." James told him. Everything. The conditions, the sickness, the infected wounds, the fever, the fact that these women hadn't refused to work out of defiance but because they were physically incapable of standing. When he finished, Morrison was still quiet. Then the captain did something James didn't expect. He smiled. Not a happy smile, a sad one. "Tired." "Good," Morrison said. "That's what I needed to know." James stared at him. "Sir?" Morrison stood up. He walked to the window, looked out at the rain. "I've been in this war for 4 years, Private. I've seen men do things that would make you sick. I've seen good men turn into monsters because war gave them permission. I've seen the line between soldier and murderer get so thin, you can't tell the difference anymore." He turned back to James. "I needed to know if you were still human. If you could still see human beings when you looked at the enemy. Because if you couldn't, then we've already lost. Not the war. Something more important." James felt something break open in his chest. "It was a test." "It was a test," Morrison confirmed. "For you and for me. Because if you had walked in there and followed what you thought was my order, if you had hurt those women, then I would have known that I failed. As an officer. As a man." He sat back down. "Get them to the field hospital. All of them. And Private Takeshi, thank you for reminding me why we're supposed to be the good guys." The 7 women were transferred to a proper medical facility that afternoon. Over the next 2 weeks, they all recovered. The woman with the fever, the one James had covered with his jacket, survived. Her name was Akiko. She was 23 years old. She had been a nursing student in Tokyo before the war. James never spoke to her again. The war ended 6 days after the incident. The women were eventually repatriated to Japan. James went home to California, helped his family rebuild their lives after the internment camps closed, and tried to forget the war. He didn't talk about what happened in that detention building. Not to his wife, not to his children, not to anyone. But he wrote about it, in a diary that he kept locked in a drawer for 50 years. And in that diary, he wrote something that would later be found by his granddaughter, a history professor, who would use it in her research on Nisei soldiers and the moral complexities of the Pacific War. He wrote, "The word punish didn't mean what I thought. It was a test for them to see if they would survive, for me to see if I would stay human, for Captain Morrison to see if he still knew the difference between justice and cruelty. I think about that day all the time. I think about what would have happened if I had followed the order the way I thought it was meant. I think about Akiko's face, empty of hope, waiting for whatever came next. And I think about my mother, in Manzanar, waiting the same way. The war taught me how to fight. That day taught me why fighting matters, not for victory, not for glory, but for the chance to choose mercy when the world tells you to choose violence. Decades later, in 1985, James attended a reconciliation ceremony in San Francisco. It was organized by a group dedicated to healing the wounds between America and Japan, between former soldiers and former enemies. He didn't want to go. His wife convinced him. She said it might help. At the ceremony, an elderly Japanese woman approached him. She was small, gray-haired, elegant. She looked at his name tag, which read, James Takeshi, 402nd RCT, Pacific Theater. She studied his face for a long moment. Then she spoke in careful English. I think I know you, she said. Late, 1945, you gave me your jacket. James stared at her. 40 years collapsed into nothing. Akiko? She smiled. It was a sad smile, tired, but real. You saved my life, all of our lives. I wanted to thank you. I've wanted to thank you for 40 years. They talked for 2 hours. She told him what happened after she returned to Japan, the shame of being captured, the difficulty of rebuilding, the years of nightmares, but also the gratitude, the knowledge that one American soldier in one moment had chosen to see her as a human being rather than an enemy. That choice, she said, had changed everything for her. It had allowed her to believe that peace was possible, that reconciliation was possible. James told her about his mother, about Manzanar, about the weight of being Japanese-American in a war against Japan, about the test he didn't know he was taking until he passed it. When they parted, Akiko took his hand. You dropped your rifle, she said. I remember that sound. It was the most beautiful sound I ever heard, because it meant someone chose mercy. James Takeshi died in 1998 at the age of 76. He was buried with full military honors in a cemetery in Sacramento, not far from where he was born. His granddaughter, Dr. Sarah Takeshi, used his diary as the foundation for her doctoral dissertation on moral decision-making among Nisei soldiers in the Pacific Theater. The dissertation won several awards and was later published as a book. In the acknowledgments, she wrote, My grandfather taught me that the hardest battles aren't fought with weapons. They're fought in the space between what we're ordered to do and what we know is right. He taught me that courage isn't about pulling the trigger. Sometimes it's about dropping the rifle. The story of James Takeshi and the 7 women in the Leyte detention facility is not unique. Declassified documents from the final months of the Pacific War reveal dozens of similar incidents, moments where individual soldiers faced with orders that conflicted with their conscience chose humanity over obedience. These stories were rarely recorded in official histories. They didn't fit the narrative of total war, of good versus evil, of clear moral lines. But they mattered. They mattered because they showed that even in the darkest circumstances, even when institutions and systems and the machinery of war pushed people toward cruelty, individuals could still choose differently. They could still see the humanity in the enemy. They could still drop the rifle. The Geneva Conventions, which were supposed to protect prisoners of war, were often honored more in the breach than in the observance during the Pacific War. Both sides committed atrocities. Both sides dehumanized the enemy. Both sides created conditions where moral choices became nearly impossible. But the conventions existed for a reason. They represented an ideal, a standard, a line that was supposed to hold even when everything else collapsed. James Takeshi held that line, not because he was a hero, not because he was special, but because in one moment when it mattered most, he chose to see 7 sick women instead of 7 enemy prisoners. He chose to see his mother's face instead of following an order he didn't understand. He chose mercy when violence would have been easier. The Nisei soldiers of World War II occupy a unique place in American history. They were the most decorated combat unit of the war, earning over 18,000 individual decorations, including 21 Medals of Honor. They fought with extraordinary courage and suffered casualty rates that were among the highest of any American unit. And they did all of this while their families were imprisoned in camps surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. The 402nd Regimental Combat Team's motto was, "Go for broke," a Hawaiian pidgin phrase meaning to risk everything, and they did. They risked their lives to prove their loyalty to a country that doubted them. They bled to demonstrate what words could not. That being Japanese American didn't make them less American, that their loyalty was beyond question. But James Takeshi's story reveals another dimension of the Nisei experience. It wasn't just about proving loyalty through combat. It was about maintaining humanity in circumstances designed to strip it away. It was about holding on to moral clarity when everything was morally ambiguous. It was about being asked to choose between your identity as an American soldier and your identity as a person of Japanese descent, and finding a way to honor both. When James walked into that detention building, he carried the weight of both identities. He was an American soldier with orders to punish prisoners. He was also a Japanese-American man who understood what it meant to be seen as the enemy, to be judged by your face rather than your actions. Those two identities could have torn him apart. Instead, they gave him the clarity to see what others might have missed, that the women weren't defiant, they were dying. Captain Morrison's test was cruel in its own way. He put James in an impossible position, gave him an order that could have destroyed him morally, just to see if he would pass. But Morrison was testing himself too. He needed to know if he still had the judgment to recognize humanity when he saw it, if he could still tell the difference between discipline and cruelty. The war had blurred so many lines. He needed to know if that line still existed. In the end, both men passed the test, James by dropping his rifle, Morrison by acknowledging that the test was necessary in the first place. The 7 women who survived that day in Leyte went on to live full lives. Akiko, the woman with the fever, became a nurse in Tokyo. She married, had 3 children, and worked in a hospital for 40 years. She never forgot the American soldier who covered her with his jacket. She told her children about him. She told her grandchildren. She made sure they understood that even in war, even between enemies, humanity could survive. Another of the women, Keiko, became a teacher. She spent her career teaching English to Japanese students, and she always told them about the importance of seeing people as individuals rather than as representatives of their nation or their race. She said that lesson had been taught to her by an American soldier who chose mercy over orders. A third woman, Yuki, became an advocate for peace and reconciliation. She traveled to America several times, speaking at universities and community centers about her experiences as a prisoner of war and about the American soldier who saved her life. She always emphasized that war brought out the worst in people, but it also revealed who they truly were, and some people, even in the worst circumstances, chose to be good. The historical record of the Pacific War is filled with horror. The brutality on both sides was extraordinary. The Bataan Death March, the rape of Nanking, the kamikaze attacks, the firebombing of Tokyo, the atomic bombs. The war in the Pacific was fought with a ferocity that shocked even veterans of the European theater. The racial dimension of the conflict, the mutual dehumanization, the cultural differences in concepts of honor and surrender, all combined to create conditions where atrocities became commonplace. But within that horror, there were moments of grace, moments where individuals refused to participate in the dehumanization, moments where soldiers saw the enemy as human beings and acted accordingly. These moments didn't change the outcome of the war. They didn't prevent the atrocities. But they mattered because they showed that even in the darkest times, moral choice still existed. People could still choose differently. James Takeshi's choice mattered to 7 women who would have died without his intervention. It mattered to Captain Morrison, who needed to know that his moral compass still worked. It mattered to James himself, who carried that moment with him for the rest of his life as proof that he had stayed human when it would have been easier to become something else. And it matters now, decades later, as a reminder that the hardest battles are often the ones we fight within ourselves. The question James faced in that detention building is a question that every generation faces in different forms. When do you follow orders, and when do you follow your conscience? When is obedience a virtue, and when is it a crime? How do you maintain your humanity in systems designed to strip it away? How do you see individuals when you're trained to see categories, enemies, threats? These aren't easy questions. They weren't easy in 1945, and they aren't easy now. But James Takeshi's answer was clear. When the order conflicts with basic human decency, when following it means participating in cruelty, when obedience requires you to stop seeing people as people, then you drop the rifle. You call for help. You cover someone with your jacket. You choose mercy. The diary entry that James wrote after that day has been quoted in dozens of academic papers, taught in military ethics courses, and cited in discussions about moral courage. But the most powerful part of that entry isn't the famous line about the test, it's what comes after. James wrote about the sound of the rifle hitting the concrete floor. He described it as the loudest sound he had ever heard, louder than artillery, louder than bombs. Because in that sound, he heard his own choice. He heard himself refusing to become what the war wanted him to be. He also wrote about the walk back to his barracks after the women were taken to the hospital. How the rain had stopped and the sun was breaking through the clouds. How everything looked different somehow, cleaner. He wrote that he felt like he had been holding his breath for months, maybe years, and he had finally exhaled. The war wasn't over yet. There would be more orders, more tests, more moments where he would have to choose who he wanted to be. But he had passed this test. He had stayed human, and that meant something. In the decades after the war, as the full story of the Nisei soldiers became known, they were celebrated as heroes. Presidents honored them, monuments were built. Their story became a symbol of loyalty, courage, and sacrifice. All of that recognition was deserved. They earned it with their blood and their service. But James Takeshi's story suggests that heroism isn't just about what you do on the battlefield. It's also about what you refuse to do. It's about the moments when you're given permission to be cruel, and you choose kindness instead. It's about seeing the humanity in people you're supposed to hate. It's about dropping the rifle when everyone expects you to use it. The reconciliation ceremony where James met Akiko again was one of many such events organized in the decades after the war. The relationship between America and Japan transformed from bitter enemies to close allies. The process of reconciliation was long and complicated, marked by apologies and reparations, and countless individual acts of bridge building. But at the heart of that reconciliation were stories like James and Akiko's, stories of individuals who had seen each other's humanity, even in the midst of war, stories that proved peace was possible because people on both sides were capable of mercy. When Akiko told James that the sound of his rifle hitting the floor was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard, she was expressing something profound. In that moment, she had been waiting to die. She had no hope left. She had been reduced to nothing but a body waiting for the inevitable. And then she heard the rifle drop. She heard a soldier choose mercy. And in that sound, she heard the possibility of survival. The possibility that not everyone saw her as just an enemy to be destroyed. The possibility that humanity still existed. That sound changed her life. It gave her hope when she had none. It allowed her to believe that the world wasn't entirely dark, that there were still people who would choose right over easy. And when she returned to Japan and began rebuilding her life, she carried that sound with her. It became her foundation, her proof that reconciliation was possible, that former enemies could become friends, that the future didn't have to be defined by the past. James carried that sound too, but for him it meant something different. It meant that he had made a choice that aligned with who he wanted to be, not who the army wanted him to be, not who the war wanted him to be, but who he, James Takeshi, son of immigrants, American soldier, Japanese-American man, wanted to be. He wanted to be someone who saw people, who chose mercy, who dropped the rifle. The legacy of that choice extended far beyond James and Akiko. Captain Morrison wrote about the incident in his own memoirs, published posthumously in 2005. He described it as the moment when he realized that the war hadn't destroyed everything good in the world, that there were still young men who could pass moral tests even when they didn't know they were being tested. He wrote that James Takeshi restored his faith in humanity at a time when he had almost lost it entirely. The two guards who were outside the detention building that day also remembered the incident. One of them, in an oral history interview conducted in the 1990s, said that watching James drop his rifle and demand medical help was the bravest thing he saw in the entire war. Braver than any combat action, because it took more courage to disobey an order and risk punishment than it did to follow orders and risk death. The guard said that moment changed how he thought about courage, about duty, about what it meant to be a good soldier. The medic, Corporal Davies, went on to become a doctor after the war. He specialized in tropical medicine and spent years working in developing countries. In interviews, he often cited the incident in Leyte as the reason he chose that path. Seeing those 7 women dying from preventable diseases, seeing how quickly they recovered once they received proper care, convinced him that medicine was about more than just treating illness. It was about seeing people who others had stopped seeing. It was about providing care to those who had been deemed unworthy of care. It was about choosing to help even when it was inconvenient or uncomfortable or politically complicated. The ripples from James Takeshi's choice spread outward in ways he never knew. The women he saved told their stories. The men who witnessed his choice were changed by it. The officers who learned about it used it as an example in training. The historians who studied it used it to complicate the narrative of the Pacific War. And the descendants of everyone involved carried the story forward, ensuring that it wouldn't be forgotten. In 2015, 70 years after the incident, a memorial was dedicated in Leyte. It honored the Nisei soldiers who served in the Pacific Theater and specifically mentioned James Takeshi's act of mercy. Representatives from both the American and Japanese governments attended. So did descendants of James and descendants of the 7 women. They stood together in the tropical heat, in a place that had once been a battlefield, and they remembered a moment when one man chose mercy over violence. One of Akiko's granddaughters spoke at the ceremony. She said that her grandmother had told her the story of the American soldier dozens of times. Every telling emphasized the same thing. The sound of the rifle dropping, the jacket covering her grandmother's shivering body, the choice to see a human being instead of an enemy. The granddaughter said that story had shaped her entire family's understanding of what was possible. If mercy could exist in that moment, in that place, between those people, then mercy was always possible. Reconciliation was always possible. Peace was always possible. James Takeshi's grandson also spoke. He talked about finding his grandfather's diary and reading that entry for the first time. He said he had always known his grandfather was a veteran, had always known he served in the Pacific, but he hadn't known this story. His grandfather never talked about the war. Like so many veterans, he kept his experiences locked away. But the diary revealed a man who had struggled with impossible choices and had somehow found the strength to choose right. The grandson said that reading that diary changed his understanding of heroism. He had grown up with movies and books that portrayed war heroes as men who killed the enemy, who showed no mercy, who were hard and tough and unbreakable. But his grandfather's heroism was different. It was softer, more human. It was about refusing to kill, about showing mercy, about breaking when the situation demanded it. And that, the grandson said, was a more important kind of heroism, the kind that built peace instead of just winning wars. The memorial in Leyte stands today as a reminder of that moment. It's a simple stone marker with a plaque that tells the story in both English and Japanese. Visitors can stand there and imagine the scene. The detention building, the sick women, the young soldier with a rifle and an order, the choice that changed everything. But the real memorial isn't the stone, it's the story itself. the way it's been told and retold, passed down through generations, used to teach lessons about moral courage and human dignity. The way it complicates our understanding of war, reminding us that even in the darkest times, individuals can choose light. The way it honors not just James Takeshi, but all the people who witnessed his choice and were changed by it, the women who survived, the officers who learned from it, the medic who was inspired by it, the guards who never forgot it. War reveals who we are. It strips away the comfortable illusions we maintain about ourselves and forces us to confront fundamental questions. Are we capable of cruelty? Are we capable of mercy? When we're given power over others, how do we use it? When we're ordered to do something we know is wrong, do we obey or resist? These questions don't have easy answers. They require us to look deeply at ourselves and decide who we want to be. James Takeshi looked deeply at himself in that moment in the detention building. He saw a Japanese-American soldier being ordered to punish Japanese women. He saw the absurdity of it, the cruelty of it, the test hidden within it. And he made his choice. He dropped the rifle. He called for help. He covered a dying woman with his jacket. He chose to be the person his mother had raised him to be, the person who saw people as people, regardless of which side of the war they were on. That choice didn't end the war. It didn't prevent other atrocities. It didn't solve the larger problems of racism, nationalism, and militarism that had caused the war in the first place. But it saved 7 lives. It preserved one man's humanity. It gave hope to people who had none. And it created a story that would inspire others for generations to come. In the end, that's what moral courage looks like. Not grand gestures or dramatic speeches. Just one person, in one moment making one choice. Choosing mercy over cruelty. Choosing to see humanity in the enemy. Choosing to drop the rifle. The sound of that rifle hitting the concrete floor echoed across 70 years. It echoed in Akiko's memory as she rebuilt her life in Japan. It echoed in James's diary as he tried to make sense of what he had experienced. It echoed in the stories told by witnesses and descendants. It echoes still in the memorial in Leyte, and in the classrooms where the story is taught, and in the hearts of everyone who hears it and understands what it means. It means that we always have a choice, even when it doesn't feel like it, even when the orders are clear, and the consequences of disobedience are severe. Even when everyone around us is choosing cruelty, we can still choose mercy. We can still drop the rifle. We can still see the humanity in people we're supposed to hate. James Takeshi made that choice in August 1945, and because he did, 7 women lived. A captain's faith in humanity was restored. A medic found his calling. Guards learned what courage really meant. And decades later, descendants of former enemies stood together at a memorial and celebrated the possibility of peace. That's the power of one choice, one moment, one man dropping his rifle and choosing mercy instead. The war ended 6 days later. The women recovered. James went home. Life continued. But that moment remained, preserved in memory and diary and story. A reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity survives in the choices we make. He was ordered to punish them. But what he saw made him drop his rifle. And in that sound, in that choice, in that moment of mercy, the future changed. Not for nations or armies, but for 7 women who lived. For one soldier who stayed human. For all of us who hear the story and understand that we too will face our own tests. Our own moments when we must choose between what we're ordered to do and what we know is right. May we all have the courage to drop the rifle when that moment comes. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel for more untold stories of courage and humanity. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in James's position?